Hello there, viewers. My name is Rob Jackson. Let's get into Nutrition Fundamentals 2. For those who haven't watched the first video, I suggest you go back and watch that. It's important that we have those fundamental concepts around energy intake and balance in order to have rational discussions later on. In this one, we are going to cover the original big three, not the NBA big three, for those old enough, not this big three, but the original big three: fats, carbs, and proteins, also known as macronutrients, or macros for short. So we are going to look at what they are, what they cost, what features they offer, and why you should care. And again, this is still the basic building blocks of knowledge for us to establish a shared language of understanding. It's really Duplo level information. Obviously, we will build over time towards more complex and I guess practical application. So just keep that in mind. Let's get right into the first one. So protein, second most abundant molecule in the human body, first being, dramatic pause. Hopefully we remember that water is the most abundant molecule in the human body. It is found in all cells of the body and is the major structural component of all cells in the body. So essentially you are largely water and protein, and therefore the amount of protein you need is largely dependent on the size of you. There are actually so many functions of protein within the body beyond just muscle. So in the general public, we think, oh, protein equals muscles. And that is true. You need protein for muscle mass. However, it's also very, very important in terms of your vital organs. Okay, they're largely made up of protein, your skin and your hair, enzymes, which are the catalysts for many of the chemical reactions within our body, which convert things from, for example, from a form of energy into mechanical energy or allow chemical reactions to occur. So super important. Also our hormones, our immune function, nucleic acid, for those who remember biology 101, so ribonucleic acid and deoxyribonucleic acid, our DNA, somewhat important for us. Protein makes up that nucleic acid component. So the list is ridiculous in terms of what protein is required for, but again, at basic level, that's more than enough information that we need. Now, most of us would think of protein in terms of, say, lean chicken breast, or we might think of red meat. Dairy, such as milk and cheese, is also a great source of protein, along with fish, eggs, walnuts, legumes, seeds, and so forth. And I guess modern day, a lot more of us are turning towards thinking of protein as a powder, immediately thinking, a whey or casein, which is milk-based proteins, egg proteins, soy, pea, rice, all forms of protein. And we will have a discussion around the relevance of each of those and their contribution down the track. But for now, we'll just stick with understanding what protein's roles are. We can actually think of protein in similar ways to the English alphabet, in that protein has 20 amino acids, which is sort of analogous to the alphabet having 26 letters. And within protein, you have 9 essential amino acids, and they're sort of like the 5 vowels within the alphabet. The reason I say this is because proteins are literally just a sequence of amino acids chained together in various lengths. That's how you create a protein. So if you've got these 20 amino acids, the way that you string them together, much like letters, is going to change the words or sentences that you can build. So for example, in order to create this very sentence, it required 19 different letters, including all 5 vowels. So we can think of protein in a similar way. If you don't have enough vowels, then it drastically limits the language that you can use. And that's important to understand because those 9 essential amino acids can't be synthesized by the body. All the other amino acids can be made by your body, but those essential amino acids have to be ingested. They can't be made. And so if we think of the importance of vowels, how critical they are to making a range of words, if you don't have those 9 essential amino acids, it really limits your ability to make proteins that are vital, given that we said, important for organs, hormones, enzymes, all sorts of functions within the body. And again, this is a really important concept to note for future discussions, particularly when it comes to discussions around things like, say, becoming vegan or vegetarian, and why those essential amino acids might be something to consider. What does protein cost us in terms of energy? Well, 1 gram of protein provides 4 calories. I prefer calories, it's a smaller number, 17 kilojoules for those who like kilojoules. And then in terms of the features that protein brings, well, it tends to be quite filling. So when we eat protein, we tend to get a sense of, the word is satiety. Okay, it's not typically associated with binge eating. If you think of a really sort of clean source of protein, might be something like a lean chicken breast, a grilled lean chicken breast. Not too sure. I've heard of a lot of people just sitting in front of the TV watching the footy and just binging away on chicken breasts. It takes a bit of energy to digest protein. So in order to consume that chicken breast and break it down into its constituent amino acids, it actually requires a little bit more energy than, say, other macronutrients. And it is not very accessible or efficient energy source once digested. So again, if we're thinking, okay, I want to access protein, I am made up of protein, it's not super accessible to be able to get that as an energy source. And if consuming protein as a whole, not single amino acids, then it's not really easy to get that as an energy source quite quickly. Again, it is needed to make all of the stuff that we are. So it is related to the size of us. The bigger the person in terms of, say, muscle mass and structural mass, then you're going to need more protein to maintain that. It's important to understand that excess protein or amino acids can lead to lipolysis, which is the formation of fat. So I can't just eat an endless amount of protein and not expect to have any cost. Remember, energy in, energy out. All that energy has to be converted to something, right? And so if we're having too much protein, those amino acids can be converted by this process of lipolysis to form and store fat. Moving on to carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are just varied chains of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There's a huge variety of them, so short, medium, long. There's animal versus plant-based. They're water soluble. And we can think of some examples of, glucose, sucrose. Sucrose is just sugar that comes from, cane or beets. Fructose, so the sugar that comes from fruits. Lactose from milk. Ribose, obviously very important. We think about, again, that RNA, ribonucleic acid. The ribose forms part of that chain. All carbohydrates are broken down to their simplest form, which is glucose. Okay, so whether it's brown bread or Fruit Loops, at the end of the day, once that digestion process is taking place, it will end up as glucose in your bloodstream. It's just the rate at which that glucose is released into the bloodstream is what varies between, say, brown bread and Fruit Loops. They're often described as being either complex or simple, and that's really just based on the chain length. So how many of those smaller sequences are chained together will determine whether someone says something is a complex or a simple carbohydrate. When consumed, they result in the production of a hormone called insulin, okay, and that insulin is released by beta cells in the pancreas. Not too important to understand that, other than type 1 diabetics do not have the capacity to produce insulin, so must inject insulin in order to reduce the blood glucose after they've consumed carbohydrates, or at least to keep it at the right levels, as opposed to type 2 diabetes, which is generally due to lifestyle implications of having so much insulin from eating so many carbs and having high blood sugar for so long, they've become resistant to insulin. So they're very, very different conditions. Type 1 is generally genetic, and type 2 is much more lifestyle. Again, when we think of carbohydrates, we often think to things like donuts and fries and pizza and so forth. But of course, we should also remember carbohydrates are bread, pastas, potato, fruits, etc., grains. What do carbohydrates cost us in terms of energy? So much like protein, 1 gram of carbohydrate is the equivalent of 4 calories, or again, 17 kilojoules. And then the features that carbs bring to the party. So they're a highly accessible form of energy. There's limited storage. So this example of a 70 kilo adult storing approximately 100 grams. When it's stored in the body, it's stored as glycogen, 100 grams in the liver and 400 grams in muscle. Now, if you're a bigger adult or a smaller adult, or if you have more muscle, that is going to change the amount of glycogen that you can store. Interestingly, each gram of glycogen is bound to 3 to 4 grams of water, hence the name carbohydrate, okay? The hydrate part being the water aspect. For those who have ever looked at doing a low carb diet and noticed that they dropped, 1 to 2 kilos in the first week, essentially what you've done is you've reduced your storage of glycogen within the muscles, let's say by 300 grams, times that by 3 to 4 because of the water that was lost in it. And there's, 1 point something kilos of weight loss very quickly. That's not fat loss. Gluconeogenesis is the creation of glucose from protein and or lipids or fats, as they're known. So we can create glucose, right, from proteins or fats. That's a little hint because it becomes important down the track. And again, excess carbohydrates, or in this case, excess glucose, okay, all carbohydrates are broken down to glucose at some point, can lead to lipolysis. So if we have too many carbs, it can lead to the formation of fat. If we have too many proteins, it can lead to the formation of fat. They are somewhat, well, I'd say, very palatable forms. All right, often carbohydrates are really easy to consume a large amount of, very easy to sit on the couch and eat, more and more and more of them. Very palatable. And some forms are low satiety, which means you can eat lots and not feel particularly full. Probably important at this point to note that some of those carbohydrates include fiber, which is non-digestible or isn't digested, and therefore can be quite filling. So as much as I've said, they're very palatable and some forms of low satiety, some of the grains that we consume, some fruits have large amounts of fiber in them, and that fiber can actually be very filling, absorb a lot of water, and so it can be quite the opposite. It can actually increase satiety despite not necessarily being the most palatable. Again, more muscle equals more glycogen storage capacity. And then our last one, so looking at fat, again, these are just varied chain lengths of ester, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. A few examples there, because we often just think of fat as this one synonymous, it's just fat. There are different types of fatty acids and esters, and cholesterol being a real key one for us, as we'll discuss. They're non-soluble in water. They are a dense source of energy, okay? And they are the main unit of energy storage in our body. The way that we store energy on the whole is via fat. It's also really important for thermal insulation and force protection for our major organs. So we often think of fat as just being on the outside of us, under the skin, but in actual fact, there's visceral fat, which actually helps insulate and protect our organs as well from shock. Has a role in terms of waterproofing, making sure that we can keep the outside world out and the inside world in. They're important for signaling. They are the structural component of cell membranes that help in terms of that keeping the outside out and inside in. And a very vital ingredient for hormonal production, particularly cholesterol, which is one of the backbones of most sex hormones. And again, when we think of fat, we tend to think of things like burgers and donuts and fries, etc. But we also should consider those which are, I'll use the term healthy fats. So we're talking avocados and salmon, olive oil, nuts and seeds, etc. Now, what does fat cost us in terms of energy? Well, 1 gram of fat is 9 kilocalories, okay, or 37 kilojoules. So compared to protein and carbs, which is 4, we're looking at 9 calories per gram of fat. So it's obviously high energy density. I don't have to eat a lot of fat to be able to get quite a large amount of energy, 2.25 the amount compared to protein and carbs. It is the easiest energy to be stored for future use. Kind of makes sense. It's very easy to make a fat store with other fat compared to converting a protein or a carbohydrate into a form that can be stored, or even, carbs is a limited storage. It can slow down the rate of digestion of food, so that can be a useful feature for us. It's not a very quickly accessible energy source compared to, say, something like a carbohydrate. And combined with salty or sweet is very easy to binge eat and consume large quantities of calories. Donuts are a brilliant idea of this, fat plus sugar, and then fries again, salty plus salty and sweet, I guess, if you have ketchup or something. So it's very, very easy to consume large amounts of fat very easily. And food scientists have identified this, and most of our favorite treats are a combination of fat and carbs or fat and something salty. So just a little summary of those features of each so we can kind of get another little visual of it. So we go protein, carbs, and fat. In terms of the amount of energy per gram that each So protein and carbs are 4 calories per gram, whereas fat is 9. And it's a visual representation there. So for the same volume, if we only ate 1 gram, it just shows how much more energy dense fat is compared to carbs and protein. Equally, when we're talking about energy accessibility, so I've sort of ranked these, very basically as protein is low energy accessibility. If I consume a lean chicken breast, how accessible that energy is to me is quite low versus carbohydrates, which is high, and fat, which is moderate. And it's not a perfect analogy, but I kind of thought this might help explain that concept a little better. So we could think of protein, maybe something like Bitcoin, where yes, it might have value to it, but in order to access it, can be a little bit timely, and it actually costs due to the transaction fee. So in the same way, protein is costly in terms of its digestion. It takes energy and to actually release the energy from a protein, breaking it down into its amino acids, versus carbohydrates, which is kind of like cash. Instant transaction. If you've got cash on you and someone wants something, you can consume that, or if you will, hand over cash. Very, very easy to make that transaction. And fat, somewhat in between, where it's almost like property. You might have a large amount of value sitting there, but in order to access it, it's probably a little bit more tricky. You might have to borrow against the value, or if you will, sell the house, which isn't an instant process. And I think that's also relevant maybe in terms of the storage potential of each, because cash, yes, you might be able to hold a whole bunch of money on you, but physical cash, it's probably only $1 million or something you can carry on you physically, because it's just a physical byproduct. And that's kind of like our liver and our muscles. You can only store so much glycogen, whereas the value you can store in property, which is sort of almost limitless. And again, when we talk about that next component, so storage capacity, protein is very limited. Okay, yes, your body is largely made of protein, but in terms of storing it aside for an energy source, we really don't have much of a capacity to do that at all, which kind of points to needing to get protein in sort of often throughout the day, because we don't really want to be pulling apart our own body to feed itself, so to speak. Carbs are limited. Again, we talked about that, 70 kilo athlete, also I shouldn't even say athlete, 70 kilo adult being able to store around about 500 grams of glycogen, 100 grams in the liver, 400 grams of muscle. Even if you're double that size, and you increase the amount of glycogen you can store, it's still relatively limited versus fat, which is damn near limitless. Okay, and we think about that property example, the value of property can be almost limitless. You can have a near endless store of energy in terms of fat, and we've seen examples of people like that. And then in terms of palatability, so I've used these images just as an example because, again, lean chicken breast, probably not highly palatable. I'm not sort of too sure of people who will sit and binge eat on lean chicken breast versus, say, carbohydrates, which are moderate to very high in terms of palatability. Very easy to knock back a whole punnet of strawberries, or if you will, eat a bag of dinner rolls. And then for fats, I've put moderate to high because they do add palatability to a lot of foods. I think a great example is if you put that butter as an example on the dinner roll next to it, it'll be a lot easier to eat a large amount of it. And then in terms of satiety, so that protein does give you a very high sense of satiety. You feel full quickly, versus carbohydrates, which can be anywhere from low to high. There's such a wide variety in carbohydrate, and particularly those with higher fiber content will give you a sense of feeling full much quicker. And then fat is always really low in terms of satiety. Just think sort of logically, if you eat a small serving of butter, you don't feel any more full as a result of having eaten it, and yet it's a large amount of calories. So as a quick summary, we still need to remember that caloric intake is rule number 1, okay, when it comes to energy, as we discussed in the first presentation. The 3 different macros that we've discussed and their unique features, it's important we understand what those features are. Equally, this is a nice little thing to remember. We can make glucose without carbs, so you don't have to consume carbs in order to make glucose. We can make fat without fats. So without consuming any fats, I can still make fat, but I cannot make protein from carbs and fat. Right? I need the nitrogen that was in protein. Another little thing to remember is the features of each of these are neither good or bad. So when we're looking at carbohydrates, protein and fat, they've got different features. They're neither good nor bad. We don't assign good or bad for foods and types. It's just they're different, and they all provide an evolutionary advantage for us, because by being able to consume a variety of different foods and survive off those, we've got an evolutionary advantage compared to, say, a creature that could only consume one food source. Then it's rather limited. It's also really important that we understand, in terms of that good or bad, it's the right tool for the right job. So depending on what we are looking to achieve, a carbohydrate might be the perfect tool for that job, or it might be the worst tool for that job. And so context is king. Once again, we need to understand what the context is in order to apply our knowledge of what each of those macronutrients does and how we might utilize it to our benefit. So, bit of a dry presentation, but again, combined with number one, if we have those basic understandings, what we can look to in the next presentation is how we might start to use that information to guide our decision making when it comes to something like, okay, I'm looking to reduce my body weight, or I'm looking to increase my body weight, or I'm looking to improve my energy while staying at a certain body weight. So stay tuned, and we'll cover some of the practical applications in the next presentation. Thanks for watching.